You can't escape, can't run away. I know how you're feeling, it's getting hard to breathe lately. I've been there too, when every color's blue. Don't even recognize the reflection staring back at you. You're saying, who's gonna save me? Is everybody out of love? Can anybody hear me? Don't you give up. Keep on keeping, keep on keeping on. Remember what I told you. Keep on keeping on. When everything's against you. Keep on keeping on. It'll all come together if you try.
Awesome. We're live. Hi, Sam.
Hello, Erica.
Hello, everyone, also who's joining us for this conversation on adaptable organization and teams. Yes, you've heard correctly. It's a conversation between me and Sam. There's no moderator. So we have prepared some questions that we'd love to go through, but please do add your question and a question in the chat, and we'll make sure to address them in the end. Awesome. So maybe let's start with introduction. So I'd love to start with introducing you first, Sam. It's my pleasure to introduce you. So Sam is the Chief Strategy Officer across APAC for an experience innovation consultancy, AKQA. And when she's not doing that, she's doing research for her doctorate of business, where she has specialized in the evolution of organization. In other words, how they adapt to changing conditions while still performing in the short term, which feels like a great fit for today's conversation.
Thank you, Erica. And so I now get the joy of being able to introduce Erica. Erica is a principal on the diversity, equity, and inclusion team at Intuit. She's based in Mountain View in California and is a former BCG consultant and corporate strategist. Now, Erica leverages all of that experience every day through her business strategy toolkit, which she uses to develop evidence-based solutions to be able to really promote workplaces that are diverse, inclusive, and equitable. Now, before she was at Intuit, Erica covered multiple roles across Europe and the US, working at several kind of multinational companies. She also holds an MBA from Harvard Business School, where she focused on leadership and human capital. So I feel like I'm in very good company this morning or this evening, depending upon where you are in the world. So to kick things off, Erica, one of the questions that we have been speaking about is, what does it really mean for organizations to actually be adaptable? And where does this idea of adaptability live within an organization?
Love the question. So a lot to unpack. So let's start with what adaptability really is. And so I think that's the ability of companies and organizations to really adjust the way they do things internally, and sort of evolve their structure and processes, really to make sure that they're able to stay relevant and they're able to execute on their mission and purpose despite the ever-changing environment. And so it's making sure that they are able to uphold the why they do what they do, and without falling in love with the way they do things in a specific moment. So this is a bit of a textbook answer that I've given you, and so I'd love to add a little bit more color on what I think it really boils down to. And I think it really boils down to the willingness to self-disrupt. Companies that are adaptable, are courageous, are not scared to self-disrupt. And I think, we saw it beautifully in some of the example of bad strategies that, were presented as teasers before this event. And for example, Kodak, having invented the digital camera, but, shelving it because they were afraid of, cannibalizing their own revenues and ultimately going bankrupt because of it. And on the flip side, I would say companies that are, not afraid to self-disrupt. I think we've seen a lot of winners coming out of COVID, and those who were able to really see the mega trends of digitization, flexibility in the workforce, in the workplace, really jumping on those trends and really being able to adapt and be successful. Now, to the second, question in terms of where it lives, I would argue it doesn't live in one specific place, but it's more of a multi-layered approach. And so there is a process aspect, but there is a human aspect. And so, adaptability really need to trickle down across organizational processes, culture, teams, leaders, teammates, and capabilities. And so that's sort of my view on where it sits. And I would love to hear your thoughts, because I know that you've been working a lot on corporate innovation, studying companies that are ambidextrous. And so I would love to hear from you, like, what are the things that those companies have in common, and what can we learn from them?
Thank you. That was such a comprehensive answer. It's so fun to talk to people who actually answer the question rather than kind of talk around the sound bites. And I know you accused yourself of giving a textbook answer, but I don't think it was at all. I think you talked about how, particularly Intuit, but with other organizations that you've seen that have been successful in this space, that they fall in love with the problem and not with the solution. Mm-hmm. And this is definitely something that I've seen in organizations that are capable of rolling with the punches and adapting. They're comfortable with the idea that their brand may change permutation, like it may have different permutations over time, as, for example, customers want to interact with them in different ways, or all of these sorts of things. But also the idea that adaptability doesn't live in one place. There's so much research to suggest that implicit choices, like those tiny ones that are made by everyone throughout the organization every day, actually make the difference between successful adaptability and not. Like having those big decisions around strategy or around brand, or the big policy decisions that often get made by senior leadership, so the explicit choices, they create the foundations for good decision making. But it's those implicit ones that really make or break successful outcomes. So it was really interesting to hear you say that in a slightly different way, because it's very easy for organizations to say, we'll just engage in what kind of nicely gets called emergent strategy. So we'll just do what we're going to do, and then we'll look in the rearview mirror and look for themes in our decisions, and then call that our strategy, rather than making good decisions up front. But you can't really have good implicit decisions, at least you're unlikely to, unless you have good explicit foundations. The other challenge with that, though, is that a lot of organizations, particularly as they scale, because I have specialized in like large established organizations and their evolution in particular, is that they have a tendency to get really refined at processes. So they have systems in place that will allow them to be able to deliver more efficiently and effectively. They'll be able to bring more people in because they'll be able to show them how things are done. And that creates an environment where you're very, very good at particular outcomes. But then when the circumstances change, there's new technology available, customer tastes drift, there's new market entrants, whatever it might be, the processes don't really allow for like change in that environment, and they don't really allow for shifts. So the big challenge there is that obviously people have a tendency to develop innovation methodology and innovation processes. But again, research has consistently shown that processes designed to deliver those innovative outcomes end up producing very similar things over time. So there needs to be this balance of novelty and familiarity. And just to bring it back to the question that you originally asked, organizations that are successfully ambidextrous or are adaptable generally have a balance of people that have really deep experience in the industry, in the field, in a particular way of working, whatever it is. And then they balance them with people who bring very diverse viewpoints, interesting experience, interesting skill sets, and those sorts of things. And it's that mashup that over time consistently gives them the opportunity to be able to produce new things and to be able to produce new insights. But on that basis, I would just love to hear your perspective, given your experience in human capital management in particular. I think that diversity and equity, diversity and equality and those sorts of things is a subject that kind of gets thrown around a lot.
Mhm.
So given your very particular experience, and I know you've got the management consulting background and everything else, when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of world or equality world generally, how should we think of human capital when it comes to powering organizational adaptability and innovation generally?
Yeah, I love what you said about, it's really about the balance of people, because, as we're saying, adaptability lives across a number of spaces and, processes and human beings. The human aspect is so important, is so pivotal to really drive innovation, to really drive adaptability. And so I'd love to talk a little bit more about that and specifically around diversity, equity, inclusion. So number one takeaway, human capital is essential. Taking us a step forward, I would say diverse themes are even more pivotal to really drive innovation and really drive adaptability. And let's remind ourselves, it's not that a person is diverse in itself, but it's more the team, the organization, the group of people together that really make sure that through complementarity of experiences, lived complementarity of ideas, really bring together this innovation flywheel. And so that's super important because, it has been shown in a number of studies. I'm just going to quote one above all from BCG that really shows a correlation between diverse teams and higher innovation revenues compared to companies that don't have that diversity in their workforce. And so that's super important. The one thing that I would love to add, though, is you don't just need to have diverse teams to automatically have innovation. It's really around psychological safety. Psychological safety is really the key to enable inclusivity, to enable innovation. Without psychological safety, people don't take risk. So psychological safety is basically being comfortable speaking up, questioning the status quo, experimenting something on the side, saying something that sounds almost outrageous without repercussion. And so even if you bring a diverse team together, but then if you don't have psychological safety, then you are not able to really harness the power of diversity. You're not able to really kick off that innovation flywheel that we were talking about. And so reflecting on sort of today's world, I think there are unprecedented opportunities, but also unprecedented challenges, right? Because on the one hand, you do have this, virtual first world. And so there are no barriers anymore to access talent anywhere. And so that's amazing, right? But at the same time, unprecedented challenges because, from a people manager perspective, we went, overnight from in-person to fully remote, and then it's hybrid. And then now we're going through the great resignation with a lot of people, with basically high turnover. And so it's an incredibly challenging moment. But at the same time, let's not forget that this is the real challenge to be tackled in order for companies to really harness the power of innovation coming from a human capital perspective. So I think this is super important. And at the same time, I've mentioned COVID, I've mentioned the Great Resignation. the challenges and opportunities, I would love to hear your thoughts on how companies can position themselves to really attract the best talent, and how can, and so ultimately also position themselves to be adaptable and innovative in the long term.
I loved this question when we were talking about it beforehand, and I do want to get to it. But before that, I just want to fangirl out a little bit on something that you just said around no individual being diverse on their own. Because I see that so often in the work that I do, particularly with clients. There's this desire to hire people and for them to somehow represent diversity, or to have someone on a team and for them to represent diversity. And I think it puts so much pressure on that one person. And then to your point around psychological safety, people aren't willing to take risks because they feel like they are somehow representative of this one aspect. But I've also seen so much recently, and I see that perhaps from the vantage point that I have, where there's this necessity for diversity in extrinsic factors rather than intrinsic factors. And I'm really excited by the idea that more and more we're seeing people move towards a space where we can have diversity on the basis of education, on the basis of experience, skills, and background. Because I think having teams that are made up of an incredibly diverse mindset can be incredibly attractive and useful when it comes to genuinely delivering innovation. Anyway,
if I can add one more thing, even that we're, I know, I love what you said. I agree with it, and I think extrinsic and intrinsic really go. There is a correlation, right, between the two, and so it's important that oftentimes when we want we want to hire. Again, I agree with you. What I was saying before, we shouldn't be thinking about like the diverse hire, because we sort of, otherwise, it's a bit of a us versus them. Like someone is diverse and someone is not diverse. That doesn't make a lot of sense. But at the same time, really recognizing the correlation between extrinsic and intrinsic diversity, in the sense that people, as a woman, for example, I have a different experience because I am treated in a different way compared to a man, just to give you an example. And so those two things really go hand in hand, and it's the power of the team and everyone coming together rather than putting the burden on one single person to represent a whole category. But going back to you, so I was...
Well, actually, I was just going to say, I just while we're on the subject of psychological safety, I just saw there's a question in the chat, and rather than us come back to this later, I thought maybe we could just take a little detour and talk about it.
Multitasking.
Yeah. So Raphael has asked that he agrees that psychological safety is critical, but what do you do to ensure that leaders in organizations are equipped to create psychological safety? Should it be left to luck, or should there be really carefully identified kind of selection criteria? Or I'm assuming he means like processes, ideas, like is there specific things that organizations should be doing? I guess it's the difference between explicit choices and implicit choices that we were talking about before as well. But I think you're better equipped to answer that question than me.
Well, I'd love to take a stab, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. So definitely don't leave it to luck. So I think this is probably asking too much of people to just being able to master everything, hard skills, soft skills, and also being champions and creating psychological safety environments. So definitely it's something that must be prioritized. Must be prioritized as a crucial aspect of leadership. It's something where absolutely, like creating training programs around, supporting leaders with guides to have, difficult conversation, do's and don'ts around inclusive meetings. Absolutely, it's something where people need to be, need to have really build capabilities. People are not born necessarily, to create psychological safety environment. And so it's really around awareness around the topic and really building that capabilities so that leaders are equipped to create psychological safe environments. Something that you would add, Sam?
I I do agree with you around the necessity for like not leaving it to luck and it being quite particular. But I am always it being quite a particular set of choices. But I am really reminded of that adage that culture is not set by your best decision and your biggest priorities. It's and your biggest initiatives and those sorts of things. Culture is created by the worst thing that leadership will accept. So it's what people will walk away from and what people will be okay with that actually really create, in my experience, the concept of psychological safety. Because you can have formal ways that people can raise issues, you can have formal processes in place, you can do all sorts of things. But if people in the heat of the moment are willing to just willing to ignore something or look the other way, and it can be the tiniest things, they add up to a C. I'm going to keep moving and answer your question that you first asked me around how organizations can remain attractive for prospective talent, but also create, this adaptable and competitive environment on the other hand. I think it actually also allows me to answer another of Raphael's questions, which is, in our opinion, what is the key factor that keeps organizations structured based on industrial era principles rather than moving towards more adaptable and evolved models? Now, I think I can answer both questions at the same time.
Go for it.
Because something that I was really fascinated to discover when I first started my research, because one of my advisors actually made his name in this particular category, and it was around the idea of organizational sclerosis, which is age-related. So what that means is that as organizations get older, they become more set in their ways, kind of like people, I think, in a lot of cases, and are unable to really roll with the punches and adapt to what's going on around them. Now, the fascinating part is that tenure of people has also been shown to negatively impact organizational adaptability. So it's similar to that psychological research that I think most people will have seen some version of, where you have, for example, a bunch of monkeys in a room, and every time they touch a flower or do something, they get hosed with water, and then one by one you remove the monkeys. But over time, you have no original monkeys in the room that remember why touching the flower is bad, but they will all try and stop the other one from doing that thing. So even if you have high turnover, or you have even a healthy level of turnover, and you have people moving throughout your organization all the time, the age of the business is still going to put the odds against you when it comes to being adaptable. So there's this need to really have ways to activate the new perspective that comes with new hires. And that is particularly true in the case of the Great Resignation, because the Great Resignation is also the Great Attraction, if you think about it the other way, because there's obviously a whole bunch of new people joining organizations, and there's a really great moment in there, an opportunity to be able to actually take on the new perspectives, the new ideas, and everything else. But I think a lot of that then becomes cultural, and people who are open to unexpected ideas, they're comfortable with them overturning kind of long-held assumptions. You spoke about Kodak, for instance, early on in our conversation. And a big challenge that Kodak obviously had was that so much of their executive team were convinced in this razor blade model that Kodak had working, where they were selling very cheap hardware but making money on the film. And obviously digital didn't allow for that business model. So a lot of the challenges that they had wasn't that there was a belief in a demand necessarily, although that was probably part of the case, so much as this is the way we make money, these are the acceptable margins in our business, and we're not willing to really rethink that or overturn that. So I think it's generally, to bring it back to what you were talking about, I think, again, the culture where people are going to be open to new perspectives and things like that is obviously going to make an organization attractive, because they believe that they can genuinely add value and they're not going to just become a cog as part of a machine. But then also being able to actually then look to the outside and see what the opportunities are when it comes to where the world is going, and take very intentional action on those, which is an entirely different conversation altogether about the benefits of innovation labs, or having ways that organizations can both deliver in the short term whilst being able to deliver on, or be able to embark on explorative activity to be able to free up the long term, be able to perform in the long term, not free up in the long term. The other thing I would say then is incentives. So really making sure that you incentive teams appropriately. There's often this big divide between people being incentivized for short-term results, when we actually also need some people who are incentivized for long-term results. So being able to have like unity somewhere in there, and then also giving people a strategic intent that justifies what it is that we're looking to achieve. So again, we've spoken earlier in this conversation about this idea around falling in love with the problem and not with the solution. A lot of organizations still define their mission or their vision or their strategy or whatever it is through a very narrow lens of the solution that they're currently providing. We will be the best airline in XYZ. We will, become the world's most prominent retailer in ABC. These sorts of things can make it then very difficult for people within an organization to understand why we're expanding into this new category, why we should be taking this technology seriously. And so I think those two things around incentives and a strategic intent really do help to be able to attract talent, because they understand what mission they're going to be on, and help them to be able to be adaptable, like when they're actually in the business.
Wonderful.
So
preventing them from digging their own grave, so to speak, right? Because they hope to be successful, but it's actually the recipe for a disaster.
Agreed. So focusing on current events, obviously we've spoken about the Great Resignation with COVID. I'm familiar with the fact that in the West, I don't get nearly as much of it in my part of the world, but how do you see the current kind of trends that are impacting companies, and what can they do to adapt and remain relevant to them?
Wonderful question. So I think there are so many trends, but I'd love to maybe focus on those that are top of mind, and I feel they sort of cut across a number of industries. And so the number one is something that we already mentioned. It's really around this distributed, virtual first workforce. So this is the biggest trend. It's here to stay. Companies, what to do to really adapt, really listen to your employees. They are telling you what they want in terms of the ideal, future of work for them, but also in terms of where they need the most support. Mental health is it will continue to be a key challenge to solve. Be more intentional around communication, around preventing cultural dilution, and so really making sure that you're intentional in your communication in your cultural building activities. And so this is the first trend that I see, and how companies can really build on that. The second one is building on what you were saying about the Great Resignation. It is, there is a flip side for companies that are virtuous to really attract the best talent. But another thing that is happening as part of the Great Resignation is people don't come back to the workforce altogether. And so I think a big trend is actually somehow redefining the almost employment contract that exists between employees and employers, because people want to find more purpose. They are redefining the role that work has in their life. And so in that sense, companies need to learn much more from the gig economy, from alternative structure of employment that are not, the traditional ones that we've really built our economy on. And so that's something that I believe it's here to stay. And the last trend that I would just want to mention is, artificial intelligence and virtual reality. And my tip would be not only think about that in your products, right, but also think about how you can leverage those in your workforce. From a talent development, learning and development perspective, from a communication perspective. And so how can we rethink and I think these three trends are really correlated. How can we redefine this future of work along these trends, and how can we have a different type of connection across the workforce, that it's going to see work in a very different way than past generation has. So those are my takeaways in terms of what I'm seeing. I see you nodding.
Look, you are so much better versed than me, and I think probably have a more applicable experience to the majority of people in the session today. Obviously, I live and work in China and haven't left the country in a couple of years thanks to COVID. So my experience is going to be very different from yours. I think there is definitely, in this part of the world anyway, there is some similarities in terms of the necessity to be able to listen to employees, to be able to provide them with an employee experience that is just as unique as a brand experience and a brand proposition, and for them to be able to buy in to something from an employment perspective that is just as different as if someone is deciding to buy one product over another. And I think there's definitely opportunities in there to be able to listen to what employees want in the same way you listen to what customers want, and to treat it with just as much reverence as we do customers, because anyone who has spent any time in business knows just how expensive it is to be replacing employees. It's usually a lot more expensive than acquiring a new customer. That said, we obviously have different requirements in this part of the world and different expectations when it comes to flexible working solutions and things like that. I know that in the peak of the pandemic, I was under a lot of pressure from our global organization to reduce the footprint of our physical offices, because no one was going to go back to the office, and we were seeing these trends in other parts of the world. And I had to really explain to people globally that their experience was vastly different from the one that was happening here, where a lot of people still live in multi-generational homes. They don't necessarily have the internet access, the speed, they don't have access to VPNs, so they can't be part of global networks and all those sorts of things in home spaces. So the necessity to be able to provide physical spaces that are safe, are comfortable, have good internet access and all these sorts of things is just as important now as it was pre-pandemic. So I would suggest that it's different all over the world, but I think your advice around listening to employees, in my case, just as much as you listen to customers, is really the answer to this in so many ways. I actually just saw there's another question in here that I think you would have a very unique perspective on. So Robin asked if we believe that culture is cemented in the first years of a company's existence, and or takes on the mindset of its leaders. So I think what she's asking there is it set in stone, or is it something that will evolve over time based on the prevalent leader of the day, or is it kind of a mashup between the two?
It's a wonderful question. So I think it's probably a bit of both, meaning that especially when a company is small and it's in its first years, the initial, like the founder, oftentimes it's a bit of a family environment, almost like those years are crucial. so I do believe that culture, it's a lot created in the first years. At the same time, I love what you said before around, culture is not necessarily sort of the moment where we, show up at our best, but it's really, when people show up at their lowest, it's very easy to let's say create a bit of a dent into a beautiful culture that is set in the previous years. And so by definition, a company growing, it becomes a constellation of microcultures of the team. And so I think this is the biggest challenge in terms of creating psychological safety, creating culture across an organization that now it's remote. That's really tricky. And so I do believe that it is it's a bit of both. So the leaders, team leaders, can definitely impact the team culture. At the same time, it's going to be probably the number one challenge and number one priority for leaders in this era to really make sure that there is consistency and they don't create, first-class employees, second-class employees in this increasingly virtual world. Something that you would add?
I do have some thoughts on that. However, I think we're actually at time. So I might encourage people to take their questions into the speed networking session that I believe is about to kick off, because I don't want to spoil Lucas's timekeeping for today.
That's a smart choice. Sorry,
on
Lucas.
that note, I can't believe how fast this went. That was such a great conversation. And we didn't even get through all the questions we'd already asked each other.
Totally. Wonderful to chat with you, Sam. And thank you, everyone, for listening in.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
See you in the roundtable discussion networking session.